We're going to do it. The next panelist is Bev Randles, and I've been pleased to meet her before. For a time, she was on the Pachyderm board. She is an attorney and a writer, and as she calls herself, a committed conservative. She's a native of Missouri, went to Murray State University with a law degree from the University of Missouri at Columbia. For many years, she practiced at a firm called Shook, Hardy & Bacon, and any of you who are lawyers know that's one of the preeminent law firms in the United States. You don't go there if you're a mediocre law student. She is a director of the Missouri Club for Growth, a conservative political PAC whose goal is to promote limited government economic growth. She's a member of the Missouri Advisory Council to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and devotes much time to trying to bring more minorities into the ranks of the Republican Party. Please join me in welcoming Bev Randles.
Well, do you all remember the show, or the Arsenio Hall show? Do you all remember that show? Well, I think it was his very first show. This was about 2 decades ago. But I think in his first show, he comes out, looks in the camera, and he says to the audience, "Do not adjust your eyes. I am a Negro." And everybody laughs because at the time, of course, it was pretty unheard of to see a black person of that level of prominence with that kind of show. Well, now, flash forward, 2 decades, and it's very common to see a black person at a conservative rally or an event or some Tea Party rally walk up to the microphone and say, "Do not adjust your eyes, I'm black." And then they get, a round of applause. Well, my goal is to make it so that in 5 or 10 years from now, if a black person walks up to a microphone at a Tea Party rally or a Republican event and says that, people will look at them dumbfounded because it will be stupid, because it will be that many black people in the audience. That's where we need to get, and that's why my goal and my husband's has been to bring more light to this issue and to try to help people understand it and how to navigate it. I am actually going to try to not take my full 10 or 15 minutes in large measure because I've found that the more we do these sorts of presentations, I found that there are a lot more questions than there is time. So I'd like to just tell you a few things, my thoughts on this, and then I will defer to the next person. It has come to my mind and my realization that this issue it's not a political issue, and I think I've said in the past that this is a political issue, and it's not merely a marketing issue. Folks, this is a freedom issue. If you are black in America, you do not feel free to be a Republican. That's a problem. That's a problem for me. It ought to be a problem for all of you, and I'm sure it is, but it also ought to be a problem to any red-blooded American. We are a country built on freedom. I mean, our founders, and if you look at the Constitution, there's a litany of words there all designed to ensure that we are free to be whoever you want to be, an individual. But that's not where we are right now with black people, and it's been that way for at least the last 4 or 5 decades. I'm sure we'll talk about how that came to be, and maybe some of the other panelists will discuss that. But from my standpoint, knowing that it's a freedom issue, that if I'm black, I've got to hide the fact that I'm a Republican. I mean, I don't, obviously. But so many people do. I mean, I've had these conversations with black people where they walk up to me and will whisper, "I voted for Ronald Reagan." I'd be shouting from the rooftop if I voted for Ronald Reagan. I wasn't old enough to. But I know Mr. Bailey back there will probably want me to talk about my days of working on Jimmy Carter's campaign, and I won't do that right now, but I'll tell you who I am today. As I stand here in 2011, I am a proud, committed black woman who is also a conservative. I am a Christian. I have Christian values. I am a member of a conservative political PAC, and our goal is to try to get more conservatives into office in the state of Missouri. What I think we need to do as Republicans is to not just make it a goal to have people who look like me or Leo and Kevin and Dr. Hill stand here before you all, but to have people like my cousin, who is in the audience out here, who feel free to come. And the way you do that is by invitation. I invited my cousin to come. When I'm in Kansas City, I invite people to come to events. That's what you do. And you don't have to be black in order to do that. In fact, it might actually send an even stronger signal if you're not. But it's one of the things when I was practicing law, my husband, who was at that time my friend and my mentor at the firm, he would always say to me, because he said I was an idealist and I thought I was going to go change the world, and he'd say to me, "But Grasshopper, you don't change people wholesale. You do it retail." And I'd always push back. "No, you don't. No, you don't. You can do it wholesale. I've seen it happen too many times." And sometimes that happens. I think what the Democrat Party did in the 60s was a big wholesale change, though not to the numbers that people would have you believe, but it was a big change. But most of the time, it is retail. It is one person at a time. I think in the last year, I have been persistent enough that I have probably converted about 5 people to the Republican Party, or at least who were Democrats who now say that they are independents and they are voting Republican and looking at the Republican Party seriously. If everybody in here converted 5 people, and if everybody in every other Republican conference and convention converted 5 people, and we all committed to doing that over the course of the next 5 years, we wouldn't have districts and precincts that are voting 98% Democrat. They'll be voting 40 or 50% Democrat and 40 or 50% Republican. And that's the goal. I think that's what we need to get to. With that, I'm going to keep to what I said. I would like to surrender the podium and let Bob bring up the next speaker. I welcome your questions about logistics and nuts and bolts and details, but thank you so much.
Just because since I'm the moderator, I get to say a little something here and there. And how we think about things matters. How we think about people matters. How we talk about folks that aren't necessarily historically aligned with us matters. And when I think about that, I think about a little quiet Albanian nun who used to teach history. And later in her life, she was interviewed. And because she was a member of a contemplative order. And the interviewer said, "Well, Mother Teresa, you're a contemplative order. What brought you to the streets of New Delhi?" And she said, "Yes, we are a contemplative order. And we think about Jesus. And we study and try to find him in our lives. And then in the afternoons, we go out and look for him in disguise." That's the way we have to think about folks that we're trying to bring into our party, I think. They're no different than us. We just have maybe had a history of seeing them in disguise. And so I hope that all of you will take this to heart. Now, the next guy that's coming up is pretty much fun. I've met him before. I've heard him speak before. And Kevin Jackson is a hoot. In addition to that, he's a nationally recognized rising star among young conservative thinkers, writers, and political commentators. He is a fellow of the Robert Dole Institute of Politics. He's a frequent guest on Fox News Channel and a regular guest on Fox News Radio with John Gibson. He wrote a book called The Big Black Lie, How I Learned the Truth about the Democratic Party. I've read it. I can't keep a copy of it because I keep giving it away, and I can't remember who I gave it to. But you're in for a treat. Kevin Jackson.
He's giving away my book. That's a federal crime. You buy the book. I want to thank the Pachyderms for having me, John and Holly and the board, and many of my friends that have heard me speak before at various events. It's always good to speak to a bunch of folks that you know are not medical marijuana users. You pay attention. Contrary to popular belief, I am not the third largest commodity traded in the world. I don't know what would be. Anyway, my commentary today is going to be an attempt to answer a few questions that I know are vexing you, as those questions vex many Americans. First, how did we end up back in the 60s? The astute among you may be asking yourselves, is he talking about the 1960s or is he talking about the 1860s? I'm talking about both. I'm qualified to talk about the civil rights movement and slavery, not because I was a part of either of them, but I did sleep at a Holiday Inn Express. Which apparently is the same logic that liberals use when presenting their inane arguments and revisionist history. The left says, don't drink and drive. You might spill something. Next, I will answer a question that rarely gets asked in the right way, and that question is, why are black people so dang important in American history? Answering that question could have been avoided if only one white person had volunteered to be a slave back then. This is why black liberals get to bellyache and the white guilt crowd gets to cheerlead. And this is also why black conservatives are at the forefront of the new civil rights movement, which I have deemed Emancipation 2. This time even the white folks get freed. So why do we always worry about the black vote? It's because black people were written specifically into the founding documents. 3 places. Number 1, the enumeration clause. They said we were 3/5. And of course, the Democrats have used that against us to say, well, those Republicans only wanted us to be worth 3/5. Meanwhile, they only wanted us to be considered cattle. All right? The second place is in Article 1, Section 9. It says Congress is limited expressly from prohibiting the importation of slaves before 1808. So essentially, the founding documents were written so that slavery would end in 1808. But the Democrats are slick. They decided they would keep our childrens. So I want you to think about that as you decide you want to ask us a few questions. And the last place that we're mentioned is in the Fugitive Slave Clause, which is nothing more than states' rights. If a slave escaped from a slave state, they wrote in, you got to bring him back. He's property. But it was all due to end in 1808. Fast forward, Civil War. It's been said that the seeds of the Civil War, which was fought over the slavery issue, was sown from the compromise around the constitutional issue of slavery. So think about the idea that the Founding Fathers had written it so that no more importing of slaves could occur, but we worked around that little issue by saying we're going to take the children of slaves, but they didn't want that. So if you have any questions around that, I definitely want to talk about that because I think that's an interesting point because people say the Founding Fathers, they owned slaves. I got an answer for that. There was Reconstruction in Jim Crow. Reconstruction was the 10 years where the blacks went through our first Renaissance. We were freed, and so we were free to think, free to be who we wanted to be. It's an amazing period. The Democrats had a way around that. They said, you know what, we're going to intimidate these guys. We're going to make sure they don't vote, and we're going to scare them. You guys probably have a lot of questions around that, but more importantly, that period was actually the time that the American caste system was born. That's when people started getting separated by economy. You had the poor and you had the rich. You had the middle class. But you know who the poor was? The poor were the blacks and some of the immigrants. But you know what made us interesting at that time? We voted 95% Republican, and we could easily be identified based on color. The Roaring '20s, the Harlem Renaissance, Black cultural revolution centered in Harlem came about because of the great migration of blacks from the South to the North. Guess what we were voting? Republican, 95% still. And what was interesting about this time is this is the time when white America said, not only did these guys come through that first black renaissance, and I call the Harlem Renaissance the second black renaissance, this was the time when white thinkers and writers and elitists and intelligentsia started recognizing the cultural value of black America and diversity. So ponder that as you think about the Roaring '20s. The New Deal, I call it the Raw Deal. We were also termed at this time, and I should have been talking about this, but this is the first time in the history of America where people were actually named after a hairstyle. We were called Afro-Americans during this period. All you mullet Americans can think about that on the way home. So until this time, blacks had shown a traditional voting model toward, is that a fly? Where's Obama when I need him? I swear there's a fly. Anyway, we historically voted 95% Democrat. At the end of 1936, blacks had shifted that vote. We were now voting 75%, I meant Republican if I said Democrat, 95% Republican. At this time, during the Raw Deal, in the 1936 election, blacks voted 75% Democrat. So if you want to know where the switch occurred, it occurred there. But what was interesting about that time is even though we were voting 70% Democrat in support of the policies of FDR, which, by the way, are the beginning of the policies that are crippling America today, none of those policies were really pro-black. So, for example, there was a program that it was called the NRA, it doesn't stand for the National Rifle Association, that offered whites the first crack at jobs but authorized separate and lower pay scales for blacks. Federal Housing Authority refused to guarantee mortgages for blacks who tried to buy in white neighborhoods. The CCC maintained segregated camps. The Social Security Act excluded job categories blacks traditionally filled. Yet, black people think FDR was a hero. Civil rights, the 60s, decade of my birth, the Great Society it was called. Now we were termed blacks. These Negroes are pretty uppity these days, and that's a problem for us since they've got something now that they never had before, the political pull to back up their uppityness. Now we've got to do something about this. We've got to give them a little something, just enough to quiet them down, not enough to make a difference. For if we don't move at all, then all their allies will line up against us, and there'll be no way of stopping them. We'll lose the filibuster, and there'll be no way of putting a brake on all sorts of wild legislation. It'll be Reconstruction all over again. Senator LBJ, Texas, in 1957. LBJ believed that the problem of housing, income, employment, and health were ultimately a federal responsibility. The revisionist way that LBJ envisioned a society without poverty or discrimination in which all Americans enjoyed equal education and job opportunities was his vision that he called the Great Society. I call it the Ingrate Society. Anybody remember the Jetsons? You recall the name of the black neighbor? No? Because the future had no blacks with Democrats. Silly people. A major feature of the war on poverty, it raised the minimum wage. 1964 Manpower Development and Training Act and the Economic Opportunity Act established programs like Job Corps, Neighborhood Youth Corps. To assure adequate housing, in 1966, Congress adopted the Model Cities Act in 1966. What do you think about our cities? Are they models? Models of nuclear destruction? Higher Education Act in 1965 to provide student loans and scholarships. The Elementary and Secondary Schools Act of 1965 to pay for textbooks. Educational Opportunity Act of 1968 to help poor finance college education. The Child Health Improvement and Protection Act of 1968. I could go on and on and on. This is what we are looking at right now on steroids. And it's done nothing. The 70s, pivotal time in my upbringing. Black TV programs were changing America little by little. Room 222, anybody remember that show? I had a crush on Denise Nicholas that you wouldn't believe. It was an all-black school that was actually a good school. Barefoot in the Park, anybody remember that show? Tracy Reed. And it was a show about a middle-income black couple who did not live in the ghetto. Flip Wilson. He introduced black transvestites. Sanford and Son introduced us to interracial relationships, interracial dating, and interracial cops. The Jeffersons introduced America to interracial marriage. Good Times. Michael made it cool to be smart and live in the ghetto, and Winona made me want to live in the ghetto. It's also the decade when blacks became soft, because in the 60s, if you referred to a black man by the N-word, you got to fight. But he didn't call his lawyer. Black Civil War in the 1980s. We were now called African Americans, a term I don't use. For many blacks, the conservatives, the key mission was to repair the black community by applying the following fundamental principles: the pursuit of educational excellence as a means of advancement within society, policies that promote safety and security in the community beyond the typical casting of the criminal as a victim of societal racism, and local economic development rather than looking to the federal government for assistance. That is the definition of black conservatism. If you want to ask questions around that, we can explore it further. Y2K, or I should say Y2K8, the 60s all over again, where I started.